He had not spoken a woman's name in 12 years, not because he had forgotten her, but because remembering her was the one thing that could still bring him to his knees. Rowan Mercer had built his silence the same way he built everything else on that mountain, one stone at a time, one season at a time, until the walls were thick enough that nothing could get through. Then the letter arrived, and 3 weeks later, so did she. If this story already has you hooked, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this mountain reaches. Hit like, stay until the end, and let's begin. The ad had been Hank Dillard's idea. Rowan never would have done it on his own. He wasn't the kind of man who asked for things, not from neighbors, not from the sky, not from anyone. But the previous winter had nearly killed him, not dramatically, not in a way anyone would write about. Just slowly, the way cold kills, incrementally, quietly, until one morning you realize you haven't spoken aloud in 11 days, and the sound of your own voice, when you finally do use it, startles you like a gunshot. He'd gone down to Hank's general store in Caldwell Crossing to buy salt and rifle cartridges, and Hank had looked at him the way people look at a dog that's been left outside too long. "You're getting gray," Hank said. "I'm 41. "You look 60. Hank set the cartridges on the counter without being asked. He'd known Rowan's order for a decade. "When's the last time you had a hot meal that someone else cooked?" Rowan thought about it genuinely. He couldn't remember. "There's a paper out of Billings," Hank said. "Women answer those ads, Rowan. Widows, mostly. Looking for a fresh start, same as anyone." "I'm not looking for a fresh start." "No," Hank agreed, bagging the salt. "You're looking for someone to make sure you don't freeze to death alone up there. There's a difference." Rowan had taken the supplies and walked back to his wagon without answering. But the words followed him up the mountain road, through the pine corridors and past the frozen creek, all the way to the cabin that sat at 4,000 feet, with its single window facing east because he'd built it facing east without thinking, and later realized it was because Claire used to say she liked to watch the sun come up. He wrote the advertisement that night. He kept it short, practical. He wasn't good with words and he knew it, so he didn't try to be. Seeking a woman of practical disposition to share a mountain homestead in western Montana. Work is hard. Winters are severe. No illusions offered. Companionship and fair treatment guaranteed. Reply to R. Mercer, General Delivery, Caldwell Crossing, Montana. He didn't mention Claire. He didn't mention the 12 years. He folded the paper, rode back down the mountain the following week, and handed it to Hank to post without looking him in the eye. 3 responses came. 2 he couldn't bring himself to answer. The third was different, not because it was warmer or more romantic, but because it wasn't either of those things. It was plain, it was direct, and somewhere between the lines, it sounded like someone who also wasn't pretending. "Mr. Mercer, I am a widow of 46 years. My husband passed 18 months ago after a long illness. I have no children living at home and no remaining family in Pennsylvania that I am close to. I can cook, keep livestock, preserve food, and do most general repairs. I'm not afraid of cold weather, though I confess I have never lived at altitude. I am not looking for romance. I am looking for purpose and a place where my work means something. If your offer is genuine, I would like to come. Evelyn Hart, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania." Rowan read it twice, then a third time. I am not looking for romance. He appreciated that more than she would ever know. He wrote back and told her when the train came through. She was smaller than he expected. He wasn't sure what he had expected exactly. He hadn't let himself think about it too carefully. But when the train exhaled its last gust of steam at the Caldwell Crossing depot, and the passengers filed out onto the wooden platform in the November gray, he spotted her immediately. Not because she was beautiful, though she wasn't unpleasant to look at, but because she was the only one who stepped off the train and then stood completely still. Everyone else moved, families embracing, men hauling trunks, the depot agent hollering at a mule blocking the loading dock. But this woman stood at the edge of the platform with a single leather bag at her feet and looked at the mountains. Not nervously, not with wonder, just looked, the way you look at something you're trying to measure. Rowan crossed the platform. He had his hat in his hands because it seemed wrong to walk up to a stranger with your hat on. "Mrs. Hart." She turned. Her eyes were gray-green, the color of sage in early frost, and she assessed him in about 2 seconds with the directness of someone who had learned not to waste time. There were fine lines around her mouth and deeper ones at the corners of her eyes. Her dark hair was going silver at the temples in two distinct streaks that she hadn't tried to hide. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "you're taller than I imagined." "You're—" He stopped. "Smaller," she finished. "Most people think so. I'm stronger than I look." "I didn't mean—" "I know." She picked up her bag before he could reach for it. "Is the wagon nearby?" He led her to it. She climbed up without assistance and arranged her skirts without fuss, and sat with her hands folded in her lap looking at the road ahead. And Rowan climbed up beside her and released the brake, and they started up the mountain in silence. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was more like two people who had both agreed, without saying so, that they didn't need to perform friendliness for each other. After about 20 minutes, she said, "The trees are different than Pennsylvania. Ponderosa pine, mostly. Some Douglas fir higher up. They smell good." He nodded. They did. He'd stopped noticing years ago. Another long stretch of quiet. The road narrowed and steepened, and the wagon wheels bit into the frozen ruts with a sound like cracking knuckles. Evelyn watched the drop-off on her side without flinching. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "On the mountain? 14 years. In this part of Montana, about 18. "And before that?" He felt the familiar tightening in his chest. "Oregon." She didn't push, she just nodded, the way people nod when they understand that a short answer means the longer answer isn't available. The cabin came into view just as the last light was leaving the sky. A low, dark structure against the snow, smoke coming thin and pale from the chimney because he'd banked the fire before coming down the mountain that morning. The barn sat 30 yards east. A woodpile ran along the south wall, chest high and 15 feet long. Evelyn looked at it for a moment, then she looked at the cabin. "It's well built," she said. "I built it myself." "I can tell." She climbed down from the wagon before he could come around to help. "You squared the corners properly. A lot of men don't bother." Rowan stared at her for a moment. He genuinely didn't know what to do with that. "I'll show you inside," he said. The inside of the cabin was what it was. Functional, clean, in the way a man's space is clean when he has no one to impress, and almost entirely without warmth of the non-literal variety. There was a table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, a cast iron skillet hanging on a nail beside the stove, along with 2 pots and a ladle, a shelf with flour, salt, dried beans, coffee, and a tin of tobacco that Rowan occasionally smoked on the porch and occasionally didn't. A bunk along the north wall, a second shelf with 3 books, 2 on trapping and 1 on Montana land law that he'd bought 4 years ago for reasons he couldn't fully articulate. "The bunk," he started, "is yours," she said. "I assumed you'd be clearing a space for me." He had, actually. He'd built a second sleeping area in the back room over the summer when he'd finally decided to send the advertisement. It wasn't much. A rope bed, a straw mattress, a wall peg for clothes, and a small window that faced north and let in a bleak gray light. But it was private. He showed her the room. She set her bag down on the mattress and looked around without expression for a moment. "It's fine," she said. He waited for more. There wasn't any more. "I'll cook tonight," she said, turning to face him in the doorway. "What do you have that needs using before it turns?" "There's a haunch of venison hanging in the cold room." "I'll need onions. Do you have any left?" 3, maybe. "And the flour, is it still good?" "Bought it last month," she nodded. "Go see to the horses. Dinner will be in an hour." He stood there for a full 3 seconds, with absolutely nothing useful to say. Then he went and saw to the horses. She made a venison stew that was better than anything he'd cooked in 12 years, which wasn't a high bar, but it was still good enough to make him slow down while he was eating. She'd found a dried sprig of rosemary somewhere in the back of his supply shelf that he didn't even know he had, and she'd coaxed enough flavor out of those 3 onions to make the whole cabin smell different. He didn't say any of that. He said, "Good." "Thank you," she said, and meant it neutrally, as a receipt of information rather than a compliment received. They ate across the table from each other. The fire snapped. Outside, the wind was picking up off the northern face of the mountain, the way it did in November when the real cold was getting serious about arriving. "What do you need from me?" Evelyn asked, and he realized she meant in terms of the homestead. "Work. Division of labor. The animals in the morning," he said. "Cooking, if you're willing. The cabin. I do the patrol. Patrol? I ride the property line twice a week, check the fence sections, look for sign of trouble. Poachers sometimes. Wolves took 2 of my calves last winter. He paused. It's rough country. I won't take you out there. She looked at him for a moment in a way that made him feel obscurely like he'd said something slightly wrong. All right, she said. She didn't argue. He'd half expected her to. They finished eating. He washed the bowls without being asked, because it seemed fair since she'd cooked, and she dried them and put them back on the shelf without being asked, because that was the obvious next step. He went to bed at 9 o'clock because the mountain demanded early rising. He lay on his bunk in the dark and listened to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in the back room, the small creak of the rope bed, the soft sound of her unpacking her bag, the scrape of a boot being set down on a wooden floor. It was strange. He lay there cataloging the strangeness of it, and somewhere in the middle of that process he fell asleep. The first week passed in careful choreography. Neither of them had agreed to it. It just evolved, the way any system between 2 private people evolves, out of trial and negotiation conducted entirely without words. She woke first. She had coffee on before he was up, which he discovered on the 3rd morning, and which meant that on the 3rd morning he stood in the doorway of the main room in his socks with his suspenders still hanging and said, "You don't have to do that." She looked at him over the rim of her own cup. Do what? The coffee. I can make my own coffee. I know you can, she said. I make it anyway because I'm up first. It's not a burden. He stood there. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. He poured his cup and went to look out the east window. The sky was the pale pink of something just starting, and the snow on the upper slopes caught the first light and held it like a secret. He watched it for a minute. You do that every morning, Evelyn said behind him. Watch the sunrise. Habit. It's a good habit. She said it simply, without sentiment, and went back to stirring the porridge. He almost told her, right then. He almost turned around and said something about Claire, about how Claire had been the one who first pointed out that east-facing window, years before there was a window there, years before there was a cabin, when this had all been just land and sky, and the 2 of them standing in the pine needles talking about what they'd build. He almost said it. He didn't. By the end of the first week, something had shifted in the cabin without either of them consciously shifting it. Small things. A dried wildflower stem Evelyn had found somewhere and stuck in the neck of an empty bottle on the windowsill. Not pretty, exactly. It was November, and everything was brown and stiff. But it was placed, deliberately placed, in a spot where the morning light hit it at an angle and made it look almost like something. Rowan didn't mention it. He noticed it. He noticed it every morning when he stood at the east window with his coffee. But he didn't say anything about it because he didn't have words for what he felt about it, and saying the wrong thing seemed worse than saying nothing. She also, without comment, moved his supply shelf 3 inches to the left, so it no longer blocked the cold air from circulating around the root vegetables he kept in the corner bin. The vegetables had been freezing unevenly for 2 years. The problem solved itself the same day she apparently noticed it. He stared at the relocated shelf for several minutes before going to start the day. The barn was warmer than it should have been on the morning she tended it first, and he realized eventually that she'd been plugging the gaps in the south wall with twisted hay and old cloth where the wind came through. He'd been meaning to do that for months. None of these things were dramatic. None of them required discussion. They were just the small, steady accumulation of someone paying attention. Rowan wasn't sure what to do with a person who paid attention. Mid-November brought the first serious snow, and with it, Rowan's first real look at who Evelyn Hart was when things stopped being polite. He'd been out since before dawn checking the north fence line. There'd been wolf sign 3 days running, and he'd found the tracks coming in close to the calf pen. Too close, when the temperature dropped 15 degrees in about 2 hours. That happened sometimes on this mountain. The sky would be gray and agreeable in the morning, and by noon it would be the color of iron, and the wind would be coming from somewhere truly inhospitable. He got back to the barn at midday, half frozen, and found that Evelyn had already moved the calves in from the outer pen without being told. She'd also brought in the milk cow and the 2 older steers, which was harder work than it sounded because those steers did not like being moved and had opinions about it. She was in the barn when he arrived, checking a calf's hoof for ice buildup between the toes. "Steers give you trouble?" he asked, looking at the mud on her coat. "The brown one knocked me into the gate." She said it without embarrassment. I knocked him back. He looked at her. She was 50 pounds lighter than either steer. How? I grabbed his ear. She set the calf's hoof down and straightened up. They don't like that. He felt something in the region of his chest that might have been amusement and pressed it back down before it could do anything. Smart, he said. Necessary. She brushed straw off her coat. The big storm is coming tonight, isn't it? I can feel it in the air. Probably. I've been setting aside extra wood inside the cabin all week, and I put the remaining preserves from the root cellar in the pantry in case we can't get the cellar door open. He stared at her. In case we can't get the cellar door open, he repeated. If it drifts, it'll bury the door. You know this mountain. Does it drift on the north side? It did. He'd spent half a day clearing that cellar door after last year's January storm. You've been preparing, he said. Since Monday, she said. I noticed the pressure dropping. He had also noticed the pressure dropping. He just hadn't expected her to. The window in my room, she added. The latch isn't catching properly. I stuffed a rag in the gap, but it won't hold in high wind. Do you have a tool I can use to reset the pin? I'll do it. I can do it. I just need a flat-headed... I said I'll do it. There was a moment of silence in which they regarded each other across the back of a calf. All right, she said, not offended, just noting that he'd said what he'd said. He went and fixed the latch that evening, working by lamplight while the first snow began to hit the north wall of the cabin like handfuls of sand. He could hear Evelyn moving around in the main room, the clink of a pot, the thud of the flue being adjusted, the quiet sound of someone who is busy but not hurried. When he came back into the main room, she had boiled coffee and was adding dried apple slices to a pot of oatmeal for the morning, already prepared, already covered, sitting near the warm flue where it would keep. He watched her do this. She didn't look up. She was your wife, Evelyn said. He went very still. The one you lost, she said quietly. I'm not asking about her, She paused, stirring the pot. I see you sometimes, looking at the east window, and I think it was her, that's all. Rowan stood in the middle of the room for a long moment. Yes, he said. Evelyn nodded once. She took the pot off the heat and covered it. My husband was sick for 4 years before the end, she said, not looking at him. The last year, he didn't know my name half the time. And I'd be lying if I said the grief was simple. Grief isn't always about the loss of the person. Sometimes it's about the loss of who you were when they were well. She said it plainly. Not asking for comfort, just stating something true. Rowan sat down in his chair by the fire. What was his name? He asked. George. She sat down across from him. George Hart. He was a careful man. Kept meticulous records of everything, the whole household budget and a ledger going back 20 years. A brief pause. I used to tease him about it. Was he a good man? He was an honest man. That's not always the same thing, but for George it was. She looked at the fire. He deserved better than what his body gave him at the end. Rowan looked at the fire too. Claire, he said. It was the first time he'd said her name aloud in 12 years, and it felt like pressing on a bruise, not unbearable, just a reminder of where the hurt lived. She was 28, I was 29. We had 6 months here on the mountain. A long pause. Fever. A doctor couldn't reach us in time. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, she said. Not dramatically, just honestly. I blame myself for a long time, he said. I'm the one who brought her out here. She wanted to come. She was the one who wanted the mountain life, actually, but I still... He stopped. I still think about it. Of course you do. No judgment in her voice, just acknowledgement. The fire snapped. Outside, the snow was picking up velocity, beating against the shuttered windows with an intent kind of sound. You should sleep, Rowan said finally. The storm will have us up early. Yes. She stood, smoothed her skirts with both hands. Rowan. He looked up. It was the first time she'd used his given name. Thank you for telling me, she said. He nodded once, not trusting his voice entirely. She went to her room. He sat by the fire for another half hour, listening to the storm find its rhythm against the mountain, and thought about how strange it was. That saying Claire's name had hurt, yes, but had also somehow made the room feel slightly more breathable. as if the 12 years of not saying it had been a kind of pressure he'd grown so accustomed to that he'd forgotten it was there. The storm lasted 2 days. Not the worst Rowan had seen. He'd been through 3-day affairs that buried the barn door and left him tunneling out with a wood shovel. But serious enough. The snow came in sideways, piled up past the porch railing, and made the woodlot between the cabin and the tree line completely impassable for 36 hours. They were confined to the cabin and the barn. This could have been a problem. In Rowan's experience, confined spaces and unfamiliar people produced a particular kind of friction, the friction of two people who haven't yet learned each other's rhythms, bumping against the boundaries of their routines. Evelyn, it turned out, was a person of useful habits during storms. She kept busy, not in an anxious, pacing way, but with the focus of someone who understood that hard weather was not a disruption of life, but simply another version of it that required adjustment. She mended 2 of his shirts that had been sitting in a pile waiting for attention since August. She oiled the cast iron in a way he'd apparently never done correctly, because the bottom of the skillet came out a darker, truer black than he'd ever seen it. She reorganized the medicine chest, a battered tin box of limited but important contents, and identified that the wound-closing thread had gone brittle and needed replacement. "I'll get new thread in town," he said. "I already have some," she said, and produced a small leather sewing case from her bag. "I brought good thread." He stared at it. "You packed surgical thread." "I pack thread that works for more than one purpose." She said it without looking up. "I read your advertisement carefully. You said winters were severe and no illusions were offered, so I packed accordingly." He sat down at the table. "What else did you pack?" he asked. She looked up at him with something in her eyes that might, in different circumstances, have been amusement. "Would you like an inventory?" "No." A pause. "Maybe." She closed the medicine chest. "Useful things," she said. "I didn't know exactly what you'd have and what you'd be missing, so I brought what I thought might fill gaps." "That's—" He stopped. "Practical," she offered. Yes. For his part, Rowan discovered during the 2-day storm that he was bad at being still. He'd spent 12 years in motion. There was always something that needed doing on a mountain homestead, and motion was how he managed the hours. And being forced inside made him restless in a way he recognized as irritating to be around. He split wood he didn't need to split. He sharpened tools that were already sharp. He went over the north fence schematics in his head for the 4th time that week. Evelyn, watching him from across the room on the second afternoon, finally said, "Is there anything that actually needs doing that you're not doing?" "What?" "You've sharpened that same blade for 20 minutes. He set the whetstone down. "I don't do well with stillness," she said. "I know. George was the same." She pulled another of his shirts toward her and examined the elbow seam. "Talk if you need to. Or don't. But the whetstone will be fine." He sat there for a moment. "Tell me about Philadelphia," he said. She glanced up, slightly surprised. "What part?" "Any part." He leaned back in his chair. "I've never been." She thought for a moment, the shirt in her hands. Then she told him about the street where she'd grown up, which had an apothecary on one corner and a printer on the other, and how the printer's apprentices used to chase the neighborhood cats out of the shop with rolled-up proof sheets. She told him about the smell of the Delaware River in summer. She told him about her mother, who had baked bread every Saturday morning until her hands gave out, and her father, who had taught school for 40 years and read Dickens aloud after supper every night. She told it plainly, without nostalgia turned up too high. Just memories, accounted for. Rowan listened. He didn't offer much in return. He wasn't built for it the way she seemed to be. But he asked questions when she paused, because it turned out he was genuinely curious, in the quiet way of a man who had been alone so long that other people's lives had taken on the quality of interesting foreign countries. The storm broke on the morning of the 3rd day. They went out together to assess the damage. The world was white and very still. The cold had that particular quality it gets after a hard storm, clean, sharp, almost crystalline, as if the storm had polished the air by brute force. The barn roof had held. The woodpile was buried but accessible. The cellar door was, as Evelyn had predicted, buried under a 4-foot drift. "I'll get a shovel," Rowan said. I'll get the other one," she said. He almost said you don't have to. He caught it in his teeth. He recognized that saying it would be wrong, that she'd been doing hard work beside him for 3 weeks and had earned the right to choose her own labor. "The spare shovel's in the barn," he said instead, leaning against the south wall. She went to get it. They worked side by side in the bright cold morning, digging out the cellar door, and neither of them talked much. And it was fine. It was more than fine, actually, in the way that shared work sometimes is, the rhythm of it, two people moving in the same direction without the complication of figuring out what to say. When the door was clear, Evelyn straightened up and caught her breath in two visible plumes. "Good," she said. "Good," he agreed. They stood in the snow for a moment, breathing. Then they went back inside. December on the mountain was a specific kind of relentless. Not cruel, not the way a person can be cruel, but indifferent to comfort in a way that made you aware constantly of how much effort it took to stay warm and fed and whole. The temperature dropped below zero regularly after mid-month. The days shortened until the light was barely more than a sketch at the edges of the dark, appearing around 9 and retreating by 4. Rowan did his rides, even in it. Twice a week, even when the thermometer outside the barn read numbers that would have stopped most sensible men. He came back in the evenings with ice in his beard and a coldness in his hands that sometimes took an hour at the stove to fully leave. Evelyn started leaving the water hot, not tea. He didn't drink tea, not coffee, because by evening he didn't want it. Just hot water in a heavy tin cup, set near the stove at the temperature that sits just below painful, because that's what cold hands need more than anything. She figured this out after the first week of watching him sit hunched over the stove, working feeling back into his fingers, and she never said anything about it, just left the cup there. He noticed on the third evening. He looked at the cup and then at her, across the room. "Drink it," she said, not looking up from the beans she was sorting. "It helps." He drank it. He started noticing other things, small and accumulating. The way she always built the fire an hour before he'd need it for the morning barn run, so the cabin was warm enough to dress without the particular misery of putting on cold clothes in a cold room. The way she'd started keeping a running inventory of their supplies on a corner of the table, flour, salt, oil, cartridges, candles, crossed out and updated in her small, even handwriting as things were used. He'd been carrying that inventory in his head for 12 years, and now it was on paper, which meant he didn't have to. He repaired things in return, not consciously at first, just as a matter of seeing something that needed doing and doing it. The table had wobbled since the previous winter, and one Sunday while she was seeing to the animals, he pulled it out and chimed the short leg with a sliver of pine and put it back and never mentioned it. She sat down to breakfast the next morning and tested the surface with both hands, deliberately, and looked across at him. He was looking at his plate. "Table's steady," she said. "Noticed it was off," he said. She said nothing else about it. 2 days later, the worn-out latch on the pantry door, which Rowan had been tolerating with increasing irritation for 3 months, was replaced with a new one. He had no idea where she'd gotten the hardware. "The spare tin in the barn," she said, before he could ask. "You had various pieces in there. I found one that fit." He had completely forgotten about that tin. A week before Christmas, he came back from the South Patrol to find her on the roof. He stopped his horse in the yard and looked up at her. She was on her hands and knees on the snow-covered shingles, working at the edge of the flue pipe with something he couldn't identify from below. "Get down from there," he said. "The flashing is lifting on the north side," she called back. "I could smell the cold air coming in when the wind was from the north last night. Get down and I'll fix it. You just rode 4 hours in below zero weather. I'm nearly done." "Evelyn, 3 more minutes, Rowan." He sat on his horse and waited in a state of agitation that he wasn't sure how to classify. And she finished what she was doing in exactly 3 more minutes and climbed down the ladder on the south side of the cabin with careful, deliberate movements. She'd stuffed her skirts into her coat in a way that he imagined would have offended about half of the population of Philadelphia and made the other half laugh. She reached the ground and brushed roofing grit from her gloves. He dismounted. He was standing close to her. He could see the cold had made her nose red, and her breath was coming quick from the effort of the climb. "You're going to kill yourself on that roof," he said. "I'm careful." "You don't know this roof. The north pitch is icy. I checked it before I went up. I'm not reckless." She met his eyes steadily. "I know you worry, but I can manage myself." He stood there. The problem was that she wasn't wrong. She was demonstrably capable of managing herself. And the thing he was feeling wasn't entirely logic-based, which made it harder to articulate. "Don't do it again without telling me first," he said finally. She looked at him for a moment. Then, "All right. All right." She took the ladder back to the barn, and he took his horse in to unsaddle, and neither of them spoke about it again. But that night after supper, sitting by the fire, Rowan found himself looking at her while she mended by lamplight and thinking, not for the first time, that Evelyn Hart was nothing like what he'd imagined when he wrote that advertisement. He'd imagined a practical woman. He'd gotten one. But he hadn't imagined a woman who packed surgical thread and noticed pressure drops and climbed icy roofs alone and talked about her dead husband plainly and left hot water near the stove without making it a thing. He hadn't imagined someone who felt increasingly like an essential feature of the cabin rather than a visitor in it. He looked away before she could look up and catch him at it. He didn't celebrate the new year. He never had, not out here. It was just another night, coldest of the calendar, with extra wind. Evelyn seemed to feel differently. She'd said nothing about it during the day, but by evening the cabin smelled of something that turned out to be a dried apple cake she'd assembled from the tail end of their autumn preserves. A flat, dense thing that she set on the table without ceremony and cut into 2 pieces with a practical hand. "I know it's not much," she said. He looked at it. He looked at her. "I didn't expect—" he started. "George and I always marked the year's end," she said simply. "Good years and bad ones both. Seemed right to keep the habit." She sat down. "Even if it's just cake." He sat down across from her. The cake was sweet and a little dense, and had a faint spice to it from something she'd apparently been conserving in her bag since Philadelphia. He ate his piece slowly, which he rarely did with food. "This is good," he said. She smiled, just briefly, just at the corner of her mouth, and said, "Don't sound so surprised." He almost smiled back. He caught it. They sat across the table as the new year turned somewhere out there in the dark and the cold, marked by nothing but the particular quality of the silence and the fire burning down, and the 2 of them sitting in a cabin on a mountain with the weight of their separate histories and the small, fragile beginning of something neither of them had named yet. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant water, and the mountain held its cold breath, and the stars above the snow were the kind of brilliant that only happens when the air is this clean and this severe and this enormous. Rowan looked at the woman across the table from him. He thought about 12 years of eating alone, about the east window and what it had meant, and what he'd lost and how long he'd carried it, about hot water in a tin cup and a steadied table and a dried flower stem in a bottle and the particular sound of someone else moving around in the next room. He didn't say any of it. He pushed his chair back from the table and started clearing the plates because it was his turn to wash up, and the year ended the same way it had begun, with work, with cold, with the mountain pressing down on everything, except that this time, when he looked up from the wash basin, there was someone on the other side of the room. And for the first time in a very long while, the cabin did not feel empty. January came in hard and stayed hard. The temperature dropped to 30 below on the worst nights, and the mountain took on a quality that Rowan had experienced before but never quite gotten used to. A profound, almost punishing stillness between storms, when the cold was so complete that sound itself seemed reluctant to travel. Boot steps on the porch sounded wrong, flattened and close. The horses moved slow and steamed like machines. Even the pines, which were built for this, went still and dark and seemed to be waiting for something. Rowan and Evelyn settled into their rhythms the way 2 people will when they have no real choice but to figure each other out. The mornings were hers. She had the fire up and the coffee going by 5:30 without fail, and she'd taken over the milk cow completely after discovering on the 2nd week that Rowan's technique, brisk, efficient, not unkind, but certainly not gentle, was producing a cow that kicked the bucket over twice a week. Evelyn's technique involved talking, not to Rowan, to the cow. Low, steady, meaningless conversation in a tone he'd caught himself listening to from the barn doorway more than once before he'd caught himself and moved on. The evenings were quieter. After supper, they'd sit by the fire for an hour, sometimes talking, sometimes not. Evelyn mended or wrote in the small journal she kept in her room. She never explained what was in it, and he never asked. Rowan read, or pretended to, or sat and stared at the fire thinking about the fence repairs he'd need to begin on the eastern section before spring. What shifted in January was subtle but real. The politeness that had governed the first weeks, the please and thank you, the careful navigation around each other's habits, started to loosen at the edges. Not into rudeness, into something more like ease. She started correcting him. Not constantly, not aggressively, but when she thought he was wrong, she said so. The first time it happened, he'd said the temperature would hold through the week, and she'd said she didn't think so. She thought there was another front coming in from the northwest. And he'd looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent 14 years on this specific mountain, and she'd held his look without blinking. And 2 days later, the front arrived and dropped 16 inches, and she didn't say a word about it, which was somehow worse. He started correcting her too. She had a habit of overloading the stove, packing it too full too early in the evening, which produced a fierce heat for 2 hours and then a fast drop instead of a steady warmth through the night. He told her once, showed her the right proportion, and she listened without argument and adjusted and was better at it inside a week. You learned fast, he said, more to himself than to her. I learn fast when the lesson makes sense, she said. When it doesn't, I push back. I've noticed, he said. She gave him a look and went back to her mending. There was a morning in the second week of January when he came in from the early barn run and she was standing at the stove in her coat, not having taken it off yet, looking at something on the supply shelf. She'd been out to the root cellar. Her boots were wet and there was a line of red on her left palm from the edge of the cellar door latch. You cut your hand, he said. It's not deep. Let me see. Rowan, let me see it. She turned and held out her hand, palm up. The cut was an inch long, straight across the meat below her thumb. Not serious, but not nothing either. Cold environments made small cuts stubborn. He'd seen a finger lost to worse. He went to the medicine chest and got the iodine, which stung badly, and she didn't make a sound, just pressed her lips together hard for 3 seconds and breathed through her nose. Latch is sharp, he said. I'll file it down. It's fine. It cut you. Things cut people sometimes. She pulled her hand back once he'd wrapped it with a strip of clean cloth. It's the cellar door, Rowan. It's not a crisis. He filed the latch that afternoon. She saw him do it from the window. She didn't say anything about it. This was the grammar of their days, small negotiations, minor collisions, the slow construction of an understanding that didn't require a lot of words, but was no less real for that. In mid-January, a rider came up the mountain, a rancher from the valley named Cord Phelps, big man on a big horse, who'd been working the land south of Caldwell Crossing for 20 years and considered himself a kind of informal ambassador for the community up in these higher elevations. He came by once a winter, Rowan's habit to make coffee and endure it. Phelps saw Evelyn when he came through the door and stopped moving for a full beat. Well, he said, you weren't kidding in that advertisement, were you? Coffee? Rowan said. Phelps sat down at the table and took the cup Evelyn brought him and seemed to spend the visit in a state of low-grade astonishment, watching the two of them move around each other in the cabin with the careful efficiency of people who had mapped each other's space. He didn't say anything overt. He wasn't that kind of man. But when he stood to leave and Rowan walked him out to his horse, Phelps said quietly, She's not what I expected. What did you expect? Rowan said. I don't know. Someone more... He searched. Temporary looking. Rowan untied Phelps's horse from the rail and handed him the reins. She's not temporary, he said. He didn't know when he'd decided that. He'd decided it, apparently. Phelps looked at him for a moment, then put his boot in the stirrup. Good, he said, and rode down the mountain. Rowan went back inside. Evelyn was washing the cups. He seemed surprised, she said. He's always surprised when things change, Rowan said, hanging his coat. Do things change much up here? No, he said. Not usually. She was quiet for a moment. Then she set the cups on the shelf and dried her hands, and they went back to the long business of the day. The avalanche of confessions, if you could call them that, didn't happen all at once. It was more like a slow leak, the way cold comes through a wall. You patch one spot and find another, and after a while you stop pretending there's no cold and start talking about where it's coming in. It was a Tuesday night in late January, stormbound again, when Evelyn told him about the law office. They'd been talking about Phelps's visit. Evelyn had asked about the other homesteaders in the area, their situations, their histories. And Rowan had been describing the various land struggles he'd witnessed over the years, the disputes over water rights, the railroad pressure that had been building in the southern valleys. and she'd said something precise about the way property claims were registered in the territory, and he'd stopped and looked at her. "How do you know that?" She set down her needlework. "I worked in a law office," she said, "before George, for nearly 8 years. I was a clerk for a man named Aldridge who handled property and estate cases." Rowan stared at her. "You didn't mention this. You didn't ask what I did before I was married." She picked the needlework back up, but her eyes didn't quite go back to it. "I stopped working when we married. George preferred it. And then there was the illness and a pause. I haven't thought about those years much. It's strange how much you can set aside." "What kind of property cases?" "Land claims mostly, contested titles, forgeries occasionally." She glanced up. "You'd be surprised how often people fake government documents. Or maybe you wouldn't out here." He thought about the land law book on his shelf. He thought about buying it 4 years ago, vaguely uneasy about something he couldn't name, some instinct about the way the railroad men talked when they came through town. "I have a book," he said. "Montana land law. I've read parts of it." "Which parts?" "The parts about adverse possession and the registration requirements." She put down the needlework entirely now. "Why those parts specifically?" "Because the railroad's been buying up land in the Southern Valley for 2 years," he said. "And the men they send, they talk like they already own things they don't own yet. I wanted to know what would stop them." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't entirely read her expression. "Get the book," she said. "Now?" Yes, he got the book. They spent the next 2 hours at the table with the lamp turned up high, and she walked him through the sections he'd half understood and explained the ones he'd avoided because the legal language had defeated him. She talked about it with a fluency that he hadn't heard from her before, a confidence that came from years of practical knowledge rather than theory, the kind of specific certainty that only comes from having done something repeatedly with real consequences. She was someone else in those 2 hours, not a different person, but a fuller one, like a room where you'd only seen one wall and then someone turned the lamp up and you realized how much more of the room there was. When they finished, she sat back and rubbed her eyes. "Your registration documents," she said. "Are they here or in town?" "Here, in the box under the bunk. I'd like to look at them. Not now, but at some point, just to be sure everything's properly recorded." "Why?" She looked at him steadily. "Because the things you're describing, the railroad's behavior, the way the men talk, I've seen this pattern before. In cases that came through Aldridge's office, fraudulent claims rushed through the registration process before anyone could challenge them." She paused. "It doesn't hurt to verify your own standing." He sat with that for a moment. "You think there's a risk?" "I think being careful is free," she said, "and being caught unprepared is not." He nodded slowly. Outside, the wind found a new angle against the north wall, and the lamp flickered once and held. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. "I'm glad you came," he said. He said it with considerable difficulty and absolutely no decoration, which was the only way he knew how to say things that were true and important. She held his gaze for a moment. Her expression did something he couldn't quite catalog, something soft but not soft in a sentimental way, more in the way of something that's been held tense for a long time and releases, just briefly. "I am too," she said, and then she picked up her needlework and he closed the land law book, and the night went on. The accident happened on a Thursday in early February, which Rowan would remember afterward not because of the day of the week, but because of the sky that morning. A particular blue, hard and clear and very bright, the kind of sky that Montana produces after a cold snap breaks, and everything is sharp and overlit, and the snow reflects the sun at an angle that makes you squint even at 9 in the morning. He was doing the Eastern Patrol, the long circuit that took him along the base of the rock escarpment before cutting north to the fence line. He'd done it hundreds of times. He knew the terrain well enough that he didn't always think about it consciously, the way you stop thinking about the route to a place you've walked for years. The rock gave way without warning. He was on a narrow shelf between the escarpment face and a stand of lodgepole pines, and the ground shifted, not dramatically, just a section of frost-heaved stone that rolled under his horse's front leg. And the horse stumbled and went down sideways, and Rowan went with it, and the rock face was right there. He heard something before he felt it, a sound like a heavy door closing, then the cold ground against his face, then nothing for a while. When awareness came back, it came in pieces. The horse was standing 20 feet away, unhurt but agitated, moving in small circles and blowing hard. The sky was still that brutal blue. The shadow of the escarpment had moved. He'd been out for a while. And there was something wrong with his left leg and most of his torso, a heavy, grinding wrongness that he recognized through the fog of shock as more than bruising. He tried to sit up. That was a mistake. The world tilted badly and the pain went from a distant roar to something immediate and specific. Ribs, he thought, at least two. And the leg was worse. The left leg was significantly worse. He lay back. He breathed through it. He was 4 miles from the cabin, on terrain that was impassable in anything but fair weather, which at least it was. He thought about Evelyn. He thought about her in a practical way first. She would start looking for him when he didn't come in by dark. And dark was 4 hours away. And 4 hours in this temperature was manageable if he could keep from going into shock. But the horse was loose, and if the horse came home without him, she'd know sooner, and that meant she'd come looking. And the terrain between the cabin and here was... He looked at the terrain between him and where she'd have to come from. It was not good terrain for someone who didn't know this specific section of the mountain. He tried to move again. He got approximately 3 feet before the legs stopped him with the kind of pain that is not actually painful. It's too large for that word. It's more like a communication, a hard and non-negotiable message from his own body. He lay in the snow and looked at the sky and thought, with a clarity that surprised him, that he did not want to die on this mountain alone. He had not thought about dying for years. Not wanted it, not feared it particularly, simply not thought about it. Because when you have nothing much to live toward, the distance between living and dying narrows without you noticing. But now, lying on the snow with his ribs in pieces and his leg wrong, he noticed the distance, and it mattered in a way it hadn't for a long time. The horse, after a while, turned and headed home. Evelyn found him 2 hours later. She came on foot because she'd lost the horse's tracks on the rock shelf and had to cut across country, and she was moving fast and breathing hard when she came around the stand of lodge poles, and she stopped when she saw him with the particular stillness of someone assessing damage before they let themselves react to it. Rowan. She covered the distance and crouched beside him in the snow. "I'm all right," he said, which they both understood to be a relative statement. She put her hands on him, careful, systematic, the way someone does when they know what they're looking for. Ribs. He saw her expression when she got to the leg. "How long have you been out here?" 2 hours, maybe. I lost time at the start." "The cold?" "I can feel everything." Which was not exactly reassuring under the circumstances, but she seemed to understand it as what it was. Confirmation that he hadn't gone numb in the dangerous way. "I need to get you up," she said. "I brought the toboggan." He looked past her and saw it. The flat wooden sled he used for hauling wood, which she'd dragged 4 miles through the snow. He stared at it. "Evelyn, don't," she said. "Don't tell me you're too heavy. I know how much you weigh, and I know what I can pull. I need you to help me get you onto it, and after that you need to stay as still as you can." Getting onto the toboggan was the worst 10 minutes of Rowan Mercer's adult life, and he had lived through some genuinely bad minutes. He did not make a sound, mostly because he was concentrating too hard to spare attention for sound, and she talked him through each movement in a voice that was steady in the way a cable is steady. Not because it's relaxed, but because it's under serious tension and holding. When he was on it, she straightened up and blew out a long breath and then squared her shoulders. 4 miles, she said, to herself more than to him. "Evelyn," he said. She looked down at him. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" "For making this your problem." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he'd never seen on her face before. Not quite anger, not quite tenderness, something between the two. "You're not my problem," she said. "You're my—" She stopped. She didn't finish the sentence. She picked up the pull rope of the toboggan, set her feet, and started moving. She pulled him 4 miles in the January cold, across frozen ground and through snow that sometimes came to her knees, stopping every 30 minutes to check on him and to rest her arms, which she did standing up and never sitting down, because she'd decided sitting down was a risk she couldn't take. He watched the sky move overhead as she pulled. He watched the pines pass above him and the occasional cloud, and once a hawk, very high up, moving in wide arcs over the white landscape with the effortless patience of something that doesn't feel cold. He did not lose consciousness again. He concentrated on staying present, on breathing evenly, on not thinking about the leg. He listened to the sound of her boots in the snow and her breathing, which was hard and getting harder, and he thought about what she'd said. "You're not my problem, you're my—" And he thought about what word had been at the end of that sentence. They reached the cabin at dusk. She got him inside. She got him onto the bunk. She got his coat and boots off, which was a negotiation that involved several moments of pain that he got through by staring at the ceiling and thinking about nothing. Then she sat down on the stool beside the bunk and put both her hands flat on her thighs and looked at him. "The leg," she said. "I think it's broken." "I think so too. I can splint it. I've done it before, George once when he fell from a ladder." She looked at his face. "It will hurt." "I know." "Do you want something to bite down on?" He stared at her. "I have a piece of wood I keep for— never mind." She got up and he heard her moving, and then she came back with the wood and the bandaging material from the medicine chest and the 2 straight pieces of pine she'd apparently had the presence of mind to grab from the woodpile before she left to find him. "I packed the right things," she said quietly, and there was something in her voice that was not quite humor and not quite sadness, and might have been both. "You did," he said. She set the leg. She did it well, competently, cleanly, with the careful focus of someone doing a hard thing properly. And when it was done, he lay back on the pillow and breathed, and she sat with her elbows on her knees and her hands clasped and her head bowed, not praying, just resting, just being still for the first time in 6 hours. The fire crackled. The cabin was warm. Outside, the temperature was dropping again, the mountain returning to its ordinary severity, indifferent to what had happened out there on the escarpment and what had happened in hereafter. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. He didn't know what he'd meant to say. Several things were true simultaneously, and he lacked the architecture to say all of them, so he said the one that was simplest. "Thank you." She looked at him for a long moment. Her hair had come half down from its pins, and she hadn't fixed it, and her coat was still on and wet at the shoulders, and there was a red mark across both her palms from the pull rope that he'd noticed later when she let him look. "Get some sleep," she said. She stayed in the chair beside the bunk until he did. The leg healed slowly, the way everything heals at altitude in winter, grudgingly, on its own schedule, indifferent to how badly the man attached to it wanted to be on his feet. Rowan was not a good patient. He'd established this within the first 48 hours, when he'd tried to get up to check the barn, and Evelyn had found him halfway across the main room with his jaw set and his face the color of old ash, gripping the table edge with both hands, while his splinted leg made its position on the matter abundantly clear. "Back to the bunk," she said from the doorway. "The horses need— I fed the horses 2 hours ago. Back to the bunk. The water barrel in the barn freezes at the bottom if you don't— I broke the ice this morning with the poker. Back to the bunk, Rowan." He stood there for another 5 seconds, which was mostly stubbornness rather than any real conviction that he could walk to the barn, and then he went back to the bunk because his body had run out of argument. She brought him coffee and didn't say anything about it. That was worse than if she'd said something. The weeks that followed had a particular quality he'd never experienced before: being cared for. Not nursed in the sentimental sense, Evelyn wasn't built for sentimentality, but managed, practically and without fuss, by someone who paid attention to what he needed before he thought to ask for it. She read the signs of his pain the way she read the weather, not by asking, but by watching. She knew when the leg was bad by the way he held his shoulders. She knew when the ribs were catching by the shortness of his breath. She adjusted accordingly, more or less of the fire's heat, food in smaller amounts more often when his appetite flagged. The lamp angle changed when his eyes looked strained. He watched her work of the homestead alone during those weeks, and it was— he would not have said this aloud— humbling. Not in a diminishing way, in the way of genuinely seeing something for the first time. She kept everything running: the animals, the woodpile, the food, the water, the endless small repairs that a mountain property in February demanded daily. She did it without complaint and without the performance of not complaining, which was its own kind of discipline. She just worked. Long days, early mornings, the kind of physical labor that would have taxed most men, and she came in at the end of each day with cold reddened cheeks and tired eyes and sat down and had supper, and that was that. One evening in the 3rd week, when the ribs had settled enough that he could sit up properly without the grinding catch of bone, he watched her come in from the barn, stamp the snow off her boots, pull off her coat and hang it, push her hair back off her face with both hands, and sit down across from him with a look that was simply tired. Not defeated, not resentful, just honestly tired the way hard work makes you tired. "You should have hired help," he said. "When I'm down like this, I have enough to pay someone from town." She looked at him. "Who?" "Cord Phelps has a son. Phelps's son is 17, and I've heard him talked about. He'd be more trouble than assistance." She pulled her boots off and set them by the fire. "I'm managing." "You're doing the work of two people." "I'm aware." She looked at him directly. "Are you asking me if I resent it?" "Are you?" She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated. She didn't rush to reassure him. "No," she said finally. "I don't resent it. I'd resent it if the situation were different, if you'd been careless, or if you expected it. But you didn't choose to fall off a mountain." She paused. "And it won't last forever. You'll be on your feet in another few weeks." 3 weeks, he said. "Maybe 2 if I push it." 4 if you push it and set yourself back, she said. "I've seen that happen." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" "Be the one who can't—" He stopped, found the words with some difficulty. "Be the one who needs." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "It shows. Not unkind, just true." "Is it—" He stopped again. "What?" "Difficult to be around," she considered. "Sometimes," she said, "when you're fighting yourself more than the injury, that's difficult to watch." She stood up and went to check the stew. "But mostly, no. Mostly you're just here, and that's not difficult." He sat with that for a while. Here. It was such a plain word for something that didn't feel plain at all. The first man arrived on a Tuesday in early March. Rowan was on the porch by then, walking with a crutch Evelyn had fashioned from a forked pine branch with a precision that he'd examined and found, grudgingly, privately, impressive. He'd been doing the 20 feet between the cabin door and the porch rail twice a day as a kind of stubbornness exercise, pushing the leg a little further each time. He heard the horses before he saw them. 2 riders, coming up the main track at a pace that said they weren't concerned about being unwelcome. The first was a man in a good coat, city good, not mountain good, with his hat at an angle that seemed deliberate. The second was larger, broader, with the flat-eyed look of someone who was paid to be present rather than to think. The man in the good coat reined up in the yard and looked at Rowan on the porch, with a smile that involved only the visible parts of a face and nothing behind them. "Mr. Mercer," he said, not a question. "That's right," Rowan said. "Wonderful." He swung down from the horse with the fluid ease of a man who rode often and knew it. He had papers in his inside coat pocket. Rowan could see the edge of them. "My name is Aldous Crane. I represent the Continental Mountain Railway Company." He said it the way people say things they want you to be impressed by. "I know who they are," Rowan said. Crane came to the foot of the porch steps and looked up at Rowan on his crutch with an expression of carefully calibrated sympathy. "Heard you had an accident. Sorry to hear it." "What do you want, Mr. Crane?" Crane reached into his coat and produced the papers with the smooth motion of a man who had done this before. "The company has obtained a land grant from the federal government covering a substantial portion of the high terrain in this region." He held the papers up. "Including, I'm sorry to say, the parcel on which your homestead currently sits." Rowan looked at the papers. He didn't reach for them. "That land has been registered in my name for 14 years, he said. "Yes." Crane's voice was patient, almost kind, in the way of a man explaining something to someone who won't understand but must be told anyway. There was apparently some irregularity in the original filing. The federal office has reviewed the matter and corrected the record. This, he tapped the papers, reflects the corrected registration. "Let me see them," Rowan said. Crane came up the steps and handed them over. Rowan took them with his free hand and looked at them. His land law reading had given him enough to see the shape of the document, the federal stamp, the territory seal, the dates and parcel numbers, but not enough to evaluate whether any of it was genuine. His jaw was tight. His leg was hurting. He was standing on a porch with a crutch, while a man in a city coat told him the land he'd built his life on had been taken from him on paper, and he could feel the particular helplessness of a man who knows he's being wronged but cannot immediately prove it. I'd like you to have time to make arrangements, Crane said, taking the papers back with the ease of a man who knew Rowan couldn't stop him. The company is prepared to offer a reasonable relocation payment. Given the briefest glance at the crutch, circumstances, we'd like to make this as uncomplicated as possible. The screen door opened behind Rowan. Evelyn came out onto the porch. She had her hands folded in front of her, and her expression was the neutral one she used when she was thinking hard and didn't want it visible. "Mr. Crane," she said, pleasantly. Crane looked at her, a small recalibration, not obvious, but Rowan caught it, the automatic adjustment of a man who hadn't expected a woman in the conversation. "Ma'am, I wonder if I might look at those documents," she said. "I have some experience with federal land registration. I'd like to see the grant date and the parcel coordinates." Crane smiled. "Of course." He handed them over again with the confidence of a man who had no concern about scrutiny because the papers had fooled smarter people than a woman on a Montana mountain. Evelyn looked at them. She stood in the thin March sunlight and read with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. Crane waited. The large man on the horse waited. Rowan watched Evelyn's face. He saw it, the small thing, whatever it was. Something in the documents that made her eyes stop moving for 1 second and then continue at a slightly different speed. She handed the papers back to Crane. "Thank you," she said, pleasantly. "Of course. As I was saying to your husband, the company is prepared to, We'll need time to review the matter," Evelyn said. "My husband will be in touch with you through the proper channels." Crane looked at her. Something shifted in his expression, not alarm, not yet, but a kind of attention. The recalibration again, sharper this time. "Naturally," he said, "though I should mention the company's timeline is—" "We understand about timelines," Evelyn said. "Thank you for coming all the way up the mountain, Mr. Crane. That road is hard in March. I hope you have an easy ride back." It was a dismissal, delivered with complete courtesy and absolute firmness, the way a closing argument is delivered. Everything in order, nothing left to answer. Crane looked at her for a moment, then at Rowan, then back at her. He put the papers away, touched his hat, went back to his horse, and rode back down the mountain with the large man behind him. Rowan waited until the sound of hooves had faded. "What did you see?" he said. Evelyn turned to face him. The pleasantness had dropped off her expression like a coat being removed. What was underneath was sharp and cold and very focused. "The grant date," she said. "The document claims the federal survey was completed in November of last year." "And?" "Federal surveys are suspended in Montana from October through March due to weather. They can't conduct surveys in those conditions. It's not policy, it's practical impossibility. Everyone in the Territorial Land Office knows it." She paused. "A survey dated November is either a clerical error, which federal offices don't make on grant documents, or it's fabricated." Rowan stared at her. "You're certain?" "I watched Aldridge challenge a nearly identical claim in 1887. The method is the same. They produce documents that look genuine to anyone who isn't specifically looking for procedural violations." Her voice was even. Her hands were not. He noticed looking down that her fingers were pressed hard together. "Rowan, your registration documents, the originals. I need to look at them today." He got them from the box under the bunk himself, despite the leg, because the action of retrieving them felt necessary, like something he needed to do with his own hands. He handed them to her, and she spread them on the table and spent 40 minutes going over them line by line while he sat across from her and drank coffee that had gone cold and watched her face. "These are clean," she said finally. "Your original filing is complete. The parcel coordinates are properly recorded. Your continuous occupation period is documented correctly." She looked up. "Crane's documents can't supersede these unless they can produce evidence that your original filing was fraudulent, and they can't because it wasn't." "Can they do it anyway?" he said. "With enough money behind them?" She was quiet for a moment. "They can try," she said. "If they get a sympathetic judge and we don't contest it. Yes. Fraudulent claims have succeeded before when the target couldn't fight back." She said we. He noticed it. He thought she noticed that he noticed it. "Then we fight it," he said. "Yes," she said. "We do." Crane came back 4 days later. This time he brought 4 men, and one of them was not a hired body, but a man in a different kind of suit, narrower, with spectacles and the look of someone accustomed to courtrooms. They came into the yard, and Rowan met them at the porch rail. He'd left the crutch inside deliberately, which cost him, but he stood straight. "Mr. Mercer," Crane said, same smile. "I'd hoped you might have reconsidered by now." "I haven't," Rowan said. The man in the narrow suit stepped forward. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Hollis Prentice, legal counsel for Continental Mountain Railway. The grant documentation we've provided has been reviewed and authenticated by the Territorial Land Office in—" "Mr. Prentice?" Evelyn came around the side of the cabin. She'd been in the garden area. Why, Rowan didn't know. And then he saw the small tool she was putting in her coat pocket and realized she'd been out there doing something deliberate, something she'd planned. "I was hoping you'd come personally." Prentice looked at her with the wariness of a man who has been surprised by a woman before and didn't enjoy it. "Ma'am, your grant document claims a survey completed in November." She stopped at the foot of the porch steps and looked up at him calmly. "The weather station records from Caldwell Crossing, which I obtained from the depot agent yesterday, show that the pass to the high terrain was closed from October 15th through March 2nd of this year. No survey party entered this elevation during that period." She held up a folded paper. "I also have a signed statement from the Territorial Land Office Registrar in Helena confirming that no federal survey was commissioned for this parcel in the calendar year cited." The yard went quiet. Rowan watched Prentice's face go through several stages of calculation. "Those documents," Prentice started, "were forged," Evelyn said. The word landed flat and hard, and she didn't soften it. "The survey date is impossible. The stamp sequence on page 3 of your grant doesn't match the federal office's current numbering protocol, which changed in 1891. I have a letter from the territorial office confirming the correct sequence." She paused. "And the notarization signature on page 1 belongs to a federal clerk named Rupert Downs who retired in 1889 and has been dead since 1892. The large hired man shifted his weight. Crane had stopped smiling. Prentice's jaw tightened. "These are serious accusations." "They are," Evelyn agreed. "They're also accurate ones, which you know." She kept her voice at the same even temperature throughout, which Rowan found almost more alarming than if she'd raised it. The total absence of heat in her voice when she was saying things this damaging. "You're welcome to pursue this in court, Mr. Prentice. In which case, I'll present these materials to the judge, along with the 3 similar claims your company filed in the Southern Valley last year, using the same notarization signature from a dead man." She tilted her head slightly. "Or you can take your documents and leave this mountain today." Prentice looked at Crane. Crane looked at Prentice. Neither of them looked at Evelyn, which Rowan recognized, even through the pain in his leg, as a kind of concession. "You'll be hearing from the company," Prentice said finally. "I expect so," Evelyn said. "We'll be ready." They left, all 4 of them, back down the mountain road, and this time they didn't look back. Rowan stood at the porch rail and watched them go. He was aware that his hands were gripping the rail harder than necessary. He was aware that his ribs were hurting from standing straight for too long. He was aware that Evelyn was standing at the foot of the steps with her hands clasped in front of her, watching the same road. When the riders disappeared around the bend, she exhaled. It was not a dramatic sound, just a breath, longer than usual, released from somewhere. She turned and looked at him. He looked at her. "The dead notary," he said. "How did you find that?" "The territorial office letter mentioned the clerk changes. I recognized the name from a case Aldridge handled. I wrote to the Philadelphia Vital Records office 3 weeks ago." She paused. "When you first told me about the railroad men and the way they talked." He stared at her. 3 weeks ago. "I told you, being careful is free." But her voice had something in it now. A slight unevenness. Like a road that's mostly smooth with one bad section. The hands clasped in front of her were pressed together, the way they had been after she'd pulled him off the mountain. "The Southern Valley claims. I'm not certain those exist. I said it to make him think I had more than I have." "Was that a risk?" "Everything is a risk," she said. "I calculated it was less risky than letting him think the dead notary was all I had." She looked at him. "Was I wrong?" He shook his head. "No." She nodded, and something in her shoulders changed, not quite releasing, but adjusting downward to a less acute angle. "They'll come back," she said. "What I did today delays them. It doesn't stop them. Men with that kind of money don't stop because they're embarrassed." She looked at the road. "We need to go to court. We need to do it before they find a judge they own. I know, he said. I can prepare the case. I know how to do it. She said it without asking for acknowledgement, just stating a capability as a fact. But Rowan, she turned and looked at him fully. I need you to trust me, not to consult me, not to check my work afterward. Actually trust me, from the beginning, to handle this. It was a specific thing she was asking for. He understood that. She wasn't asking for gratitude or praise or even agreement. She was asking for the particular trust that meant stepping back entirely, which, for a man who had run this land alone for 14 years, was not a small ask. He looked at her standing in the March sunlight in her worn coat, with the folded evidence in her pocket that she'd spent 3 weeks quietly assembling, and he thought about hot water in a tin cup and a steadied table and a toboggan pulled 4 miles through January snow. All right, he said. She nodded once. She turned to go back inside. Evelyn, she stopped. You were something else out there, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, without turning around, he heard it. Not quite a laugh, not quite, not one. I was who I've always been, she said. You just hadn't seen that part yet. She went inside. He stayed at the rail a moment longer, looking at the mountain and the sky above it, and the long road the railroad men had ridden down. And he thought that this was not over. Prentice's parting words had the texture of a promise rather than a retreat. But for the first time since he'd hit the rock face and the sky had gone wrong, he did not feel like he was standing on the edge of losing everything. He felt, cautiously, like he was standing next to someone who knew how to fight. Prentice's letter arrived 11 days later, delivered by a rider who didn't wait for a response. It was formal, dense with legal language, and made 3 things clear. Continental Mountain Railway intended to pursue the land claim through the territorial court in Harlow. The hearing was scheduled for the 14th of April, and the company's position was that Rowan Mercer's original homestead filing contained material deficiencies that rendered it legally void. The letter was 4 pages long and used the word furthermore 7 times, which Evelyn said was the legal equivalent of a man raising his voice because his argument was weak. She read it twice at the table, set it down, and sat quietly for a moment with her hands flat on the wood. They moved fast, Rowan said. They're scared, she said. Scared people move fast and make mistakes. She tapped the letter. They've changed their argument. They've dropped the fabricated survey. They know I have the documentation to destroy it. And now they're claiming your original filing was deficient. That's a harder argument for them because they have to prove a negative. They have to show what was missing, not just produce a document. Can they? Not with your records as they stand. She looked up. But here's the problem. We're going to Harlow. Continental Mountain Railway has been doing business in this territory for 6 years and spending money in Harlow the entire time. The judge assigned to this case, she checked the letter again, is a man named Birch. I don't know him. I don't know who owns him, if anyone does. That's the variable I can't calculate from here. Rowan's leg had been out of the splint for 10 days. He was walking without the crutch now, though not well. A hitch in his gait that the doctor in Caldwell Crossing had said might be permanent, or might resolve in 6 months, depending on factors he declined to specify. The ribs were mostly healed. He was functional, which was not the same as whole, but it was enough. When do we leave? He said. We need 4 days to prepare properly, Evelyn said. I want to write to the Territorial Land Office in Helena again. There's a registrar there named Coombs who responded to my last letter with more detail than was strictly required. That usually means someone who wants the truth out. She paused. And I want to talk to Cord Phelps. Phelps. Why? Because the Southern Valley claims I mentioned to Prentice, the ones I may have implied I had documentation for. She looked at him evenly. I need to know if they're real. If the railroad has been filing fraudulent claims down there too, Phelps will know. The Valley ranchers talk. Rowan was quiet for a moment. You bluffed Prentice. I implied, she said. There's a narrow difference, and I stayed on the right side of it. A beat. Mostly. He looked at her for a long moment. What if Phelps doesn't know anything? Then we go to court with what we have, which is solid. But if the railroad has done this to other homesteaders... She stopped, and something moved through her expression, something with heat in it that she kept controlled. If there are other families who've been pushed off land using the same forged documents, the same dead notary, that's not one fraudulent claim. That's a pattern. And a judge who isn't bought will see the difference. They rode down to Phelps's ranch the next morning, Rowan on his horse with his jaw set against the discomfort, and Evelyn on the mare she'd been using since November. The sky was the uncertain gray of early April, snow still on the high ground, but the lower pastures showing the first pale suggestion of green underneath the brown. Phelps met them in his yard with the look of a man who had been expecting something, though not necessarily this. "Heard Crane's men came up your mountain," he said. "Twice," Rowan said. Phelps looked at Evelyn. "And you sent them off." "The first time," she said. "The second time bought us until April 14th. She dismounted and came straight to the point because she was always straight to the point. "The railroad filed fraudulent land grants, forged federal documents, fabricated survey dates, a dead notary's signature. Has anyone in the Southern Valley had similar visits?" Phelps was quiet for just long enough to confirm what Evelyn had hoped. "The Garrity family," he said, "and old Pete Svensson. Both of them got papers this past winter. Garrity left, took the railroad's relocation money, and went to Oregon. Svensson held on, but he's old and he's alone, and I don't think he knows what to do." He looked at Rowan. "I didn't know it was forged. I thought they had some legal angle. Railroads usually do." "Not this time," Evelyn said. "Can you get me a meeting with Svensson before the 14th? "Probably," Phelps said. "He doesn't trust easy." "Tell him I'm not asking him to fight. I'm asking him to tell the truth in front of a judge, that's all." Phelps looked at her for a moment the way people look at something they're reassessing. "You were a lawyer?" he said. "A clerk," she said. "Close enough," Phelps said, and went inside to write the letter to Svensson. Pete Svensson was 73 years old, with a face that had been worked on by 40 Montana winters until it had the texture of old saddle leather, and he sat across his kitchen table from Evelyn with the deep wariness of a man who had been let down by most things that had ever promised him help. "I don't go to courtrooms," he said. "I don't like what happens to men like me in courtrooms." "What do you think happens?" Evelyn asked. "Rich men win." "Sometimes," she said. "Not always. Not when the evidence is clean enough that even a bought judge can't explain away the problem." She set the dead notary documentation on his table. "Rupert Downs. Does that name appear on the papers the railroad gave you?" Svensson looked at her. Then he got up, moved to a wooden box on his shelf, and came back with his own papers. He spread them out and found the notarization signature. "Rupert Downs, Federal Land Clerk, Territory of Montana." "Same man," Evelyn said. "Rupert Downs retired in 1889. He died in 1892. Every document he appears on after that date is a forgery. That's not my opinion. It's a fact of public record. I have the death certificate and the territorial office confirmation." She paused. "If you come to Harlow and say simply that you received documents with this signature and that you believe them to be genuine, you don't have to argue anything. You don't have to fight anyone. You just tell what happened to you and let the pattern speak for itself." Svensson looked at the papers on his table for a long time. Outside his window, his land ran flat and then rose toward the hills, 400 acres that he had broken and built and held for 26 years. "My wife is buried on this property," he said. "I know," Evelyn said quietly. "I'm not leaving." "Then come to Harlow." He came. The ride to Harlow took a day and a half. Rowan drove the wagon. Evelyn sat beside him with a leather satchel between her feet containing every document she'd assembled over the preceding weeks. Originals, copies, the correspondence with Helena, the weather station records, Downs's death certificate, and a carefully ordered summary of the fraudulent claim pattern she'd written out by hand the night before they left. They didn't talk much on the road. That wasn't unusual for them. But the quality of the quiet was different than it had been in November. Not the careful quiet of two strangers navigating each other, but the quiet of two people who had said enough to know they didn't need to fill every mile with words. At some point in the second afternoon, with Harlow's rooftops visible in the pale distance, Evelyn said, "If Birch is bought, if he rules against the evidence, we can appeal to the federal circuit. The documentation is strong enough. It would take longer." "How much longer?" "A year, maybe 2. He thought about that. A year or 2 of uncertainty, of the railroad's lawyers circling. He thought about the mountain and the cabin and the east window and the 14 years of work that sat in that satchel between her feet. "Then we appeal," he said. She looked at him. "You're sure?" "I'm sure." She nodded. She looked back at the road. "Rowan," she said after a while. "Yeah, when this is done," she stopped, started differently. "I want you to know that however it goes, whatever the judge decides, I'm not—" Another stop. He waited. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. It came out roughly, as if she'd had to force it past something, and she looked straight ahead at the road when she said it. "I just wanted that to be clear, before we go in there, so you know it's not conditional." He looked at her profile in the thin afternoon light, the silver streaks at her temples, the particular set of her jaw that he'd come to recognize as the outer edge of something felt. "I know," he said. She nodded once, quickly, and didn't say anything else. Neither did he, but something had been placed on the table between them, clearly and without ornamentation, and they both knew it was there. The Harlow Courthouse was a 2-story brick building with territorial ambitions that slightly exceeded its budget. The cornices were elaborate, the windows less so. It smelled of wood polish and old paper and the particular anxious energy of a place where things are decided. Judge Harlan Birch was 60, compact, with a gray mustache trimmed short and eyes that moved quickly. Rowan watched him settle at the bench and tried to read him the way he read weather, looking for the signs of what was coming rather than what was present. Prentice had brought 2 other lawyers. They sat at their table with the settled confidence of men who had done this before and expected a particular outcome. Evelyn sat beside Rowan at the opposite table with her satchel open and her materials arranged in the order she'd used them, and she looked at Prentice's team without expression and without apparent concern, which Rowan suspected was at least partially a performance but was an effective one. Birch opened the proceeding and gave the floor to Prentice first, which made sense procedurally since the railroad was the claiming party. Prentice was good. Rowan gave him that. He presented the railroad's case with the smooth fluency of someone who had spent years making complicated falsehoods sound like simple truths. He spoke about deficiencies in original homestead filings. He cited territorial statutes. He presented 3 witnesses from the land office, men Rowan didn't recognize, who testified in careful, vague language that there had been questions about certain filings in the high-terrain region. Birch listened. His expression was unreadable. When Prentice finished, Birch looked at Evelyn. "The respondent's counsel," he said, and something in his voice was neither warm nor cold. Evelyn stood. She began with the original filing documentation. She walked Birch through every element, the registration date, the parcel coordinates, the occupation records. In the patient, precise way of someone who understood that clarity was more persuasive than argument. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't perform outrage. She built the case the way Rowan built fences. 1 post at a time, each one set solid before moving to the next. Then she produced the forged documents. She explained the survey date impossibility and presented the weather station records. She explained the notarization sequence error and presented the territorial office letter. And then she placed Rupert Downs' death certificate on the evidence table and said quietly, "Every document Continental Mountain Railway has filed in support of this claim bears the signature of a man who died 4 years before those documents were created." The room was not entirely silent. There were other people present, other parties waiting for other matters. But it got close. Prentice was on his feet. "Your Honor, the authenticity of the notarization has not been independently—" "Mr. Prentice," Birch's voice was flat. "Sit down." Prentice sat. Birch looked at the death certificate. He looked at it for a long time, then he looked at Prentice. "Are you aware of this?" "Your Honor, the company's documentation was processed through the standard channels. I asked if you were aware of this specific fact." The notary. "Answer the question." A pause. "The company relies on its land agents to verify." "That's not an answer," Birch said. Then Evelyn said, "Your Honor, if it would be useful, I have a second witness." Birch looked at her. "Bring them." Pete Svensson came forward from the back of the room where he'd been sitting with his hat in his hand since the proceeding began. He was old and his hand shook slightly and he moved slowly, but when he sat in the witness chair he looked at the judge with the steady eyes of a man who had decided to say a true thing and was going to say it regardless of what happened next. Evelyn asked him 3 questions. Just 3. Had he received documents from Continental Mountain Railway claiming ownership of his land? Yes. Did those documents bear the name Rupert Downs as the notarizing official? Yes. And had anyone from the railroad informed him that Rupert Downs had been dead for 4 years at the time those documents were created? No. She sat down. Prentice looked at his two colleagues. Something was happening at their table that Rowan couldn't entirely see but could read from the quality of the stillness. A rapid, whispered negotiation conducted with the suppressed urgency of men deciding how much to sacrifice to save the rest. Then the younger of Prentice's colleagues stood up. "Your Honor," he said, "the company's—" He stopped, started again. "I need to advise the court that I have become aware, in the course of this proceeding, of certain irregularities in the documentation preparation process." Prentice turned and looked at him with an expression that could have stopped a clock. The young lawyer looked back at Prentice for 1 second, and then looked away, at the judge, and kept going. He was not confessing everything. Rowan understood that even as it was happening, understood that this was a controlled release, a tactical sacrifice designed to limit damage. But what he was saying was enough. He confirmed that the survey dates were inaccurate. He confirmed that the notarization had been applied to documents post-dated beyond Downs' death. He described it as an administrative error in the documentation process, which was the most dishonest, honest thing Rowan had ever heard. But the core admission was there. The documents were false. The room reacted. Not dramatically. This wasn't the kind of crowd that cheered. But there was a distinct shift in the air, the sound of people exhaling. Birch let the silence run for a moment after the young lawyer sat back down. Then he straightened in his chair. "Mr. Prentice," he said, "your company has presented to this court land grant documents that are demonstrably forged. I am not going to rule on the question of intent today, because that question belongs in a different proceeding. What I'm going to rule on is the matter before me." He looked at his papers. "The respondent's original homestead registration is complete, properly documented, and has not been credibly challenged on any legitimate grounds. The railroad's claim to this parcel fails for lack of valid foundation." He set his papers down. "The land remains with Mercer. The railroad's claim is dismissed." He struck the gavel once, efficiently, like a man who didn't need drama to make a point. Prentice was already gathering his papers with the controlled movements of someone managing a significant anger. The young lawyer sat without moving, looking at the table. The third lawyer was writing something rapidly in a notebook that Rowan suspected was a list of problems. Rowan sat at the table and looked at the gavel that had just given him back his mountain. His chest felt strange. Not pain, the ribs had mostly healed, but something else, something in the region of the ribs that wasn't physical. Evelyn was putting her documents back in the satchel with the same careful order she'd taken them out with, and her hands were not shaking now, he noticed, and her face was composed, and she looked, not triumphant, not the way he might have expected. She looked like someone who had done the thing they set out to do and was already thinking about what needed doing next. He put his hand over hers on the table. She stilled. She looked down at his hand over hers. She didn't move her hand away. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up at him. "Thank you," he said. Not the way he'd said it in the cabin when she set his leg, though he'd meant that too, more than he'd been able to express. This was different. This was thank you for 3 weeks of quiet preparation, for the dead notary and the weather records and the letter to Helena, for Svensson, brought gently into the room, for standing in the March sunlight and dismantling Prentice's case with the flat, steady certainty of someone who didn't need anyone's permission to know she was right. "For I'm not going anywhere," said on a flat road with her eyes straight ahead. "For all of it." She looked at him for a moment with those gray-green eyes, and then she turned her hand under his and held it, briefly but deliberately, the way you hold something you mean to hold. "Let's go home," she said. They walked out of the Harlow courthouse into the April afternoon. Svensson was waiting on the steps, hat still in his hands, and when he saw them, he looked at their faces and nodded once, slowly, with the deep relief of a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a long time and has just been allowed to set it down. "Well," he said. "Well," Rowan agreed. They drove back toward the mountain in the long light of the late afternoon, the wagon moving through country that was beginning, slowly and imperfectly, to turn green again. The high peaks still held their snow. They would for another month yet. But down in the lower meadows the light had a different quality than it had in January, warmer, more direct, with the particular generosity of spring in a place that earns it. Rowan drove. Evelyn sat beside him with her satchel on her lap, and after a while she leaned her shoulder against his arm, just slightly, in the unself-conscious way of someone who has made a decision and is done deliberating about it. He didn't move away. He drove with her shoulder against his arm and the mountain growing ahead of them in the fading light, and he thought about 14 years and east windows and the particular weight of solitude that you stop noticing because you've carried it so long, and how strange it was that the person who had lifted it from him had done so not with any single dramatic gesture, but with thread and hot water and a dead notary's name, accumulated over months of ordinary days. The road steepened. The pines closed in on both sides. The air dropped 20 degrees in the space of a mile, the way it always did this high. Home, he thought. Still hours. He didn't say it out loud, but she was leaning against his arm, and the road was familiar under the wheels, and the mountain was where it had always been, waiting with its cold and its silence and the east window that faced the sunrise. It was enough. Spring came to the mountain the way it always did, not all at once, not generously, but in installments, like a debt being paid back slowly by something that owed you and knew it. The snow retreated from the lower slopes first, leaving the ground beneath it dark and soft, and smelling of things that had been waiting a long time to breathe. The creek that ran along the eastern property line, frozen solid since November, broke up in the first week of April with a sound like distant artillery, sudden, percussive, then gone, and by mid-month it was running fast and loud over its rocks the way it did every year, as if it had somewhere urgent to be. Rowan's leg was better. Not right. He suspected it would never be entirely right again, that the hitch in his gait was going to be a permanent feature of how he moved through the world, but functional in the full sense of the word. He was doing the Eastern Patrol again, both fence lines, the full circuit. He was splitting his own wood. He was himself again, mostly, with the addition of a limp that he'd stopped being angry about somewhere around the third week of April, when he'd realized the anger was costing him more than the limp. What had changed on the mountain was harder to name than what had healed. It was in the small things, the way most real changes are. The dried flower stem Evelyn had put in the bottle on the windowsill in November had been replaced twice, once with a sprig of pine she'd found with an interesting curve to it, and now with the first pale attempt at a wildflower she'd spotted at the edge of the south meadow, still mostly closed, not quite ready, but present. The medicine chest had been fully restocked, the brittle thread replaced with good thread, the iodine replenished, a proper bandaging kit added. The supply inventory on the corner of the table was updated in her handwriting every few days with a precision he'd come to rely on without quite deciding to. And there was the matter of the mornings. He still woke first now. He'd reclaimed that sometime in March, the insomnia of a man whose leg ached in the cold hours before dawn. He made the coffee. He'd learned, without being taught, the proportion she preferred, stronger than he took his, with the ground settled rather than strained, and it was ready when she came out of her room in the gray early light, and she took it without comment and went to the east window and looked at the mountain the way he used to look at it alone. He watched her do this and felt something he didn't have precise language for. Not sentiment, exactly. Something more solid than that. They were 3 weeks past the Harlow ruling when a letter arrived from Caldwell Crossing. Not from Prentice, not from the railroad, but from a man named Earl Coombs, the registrar at the Helena Territorial Office, who had been Evelyn's correspondent during the case preparation. She read it at the table and was quiet for a moment afterward. "What does he want?" Rowan asked. "He's been investigating the railroad's other filings." She set the letter down. "The Southern Valley claims, the ones I implied I had documentation for, it turns out they were real. 4 families, all forged documents, all the same dead notary." She paused. 3 of them took the relocation money before anyone knew to fight back. He looked at her. "Garrity." "Garrity. 2 others. And 1 family, I don't know. Gone to Oregon, to Idaho, 1 to Kansas." She put her hands flat on the table. "They don't get their land back. Even with the fraud exposed, they accepted payment. Legally, it's complicated." The room was quiet for a moment with the weight of that. "Svensson?" Rowan asked. "Svensson's claim is being reviewed. Coombs thinks he'll prevail. The fraud is documented now. Our case established the pattern." She looked out the window at the mountain. "Coombs says the railroad's lawyers are in significant trouble. The young one, the one who admitted the irregularities in court, apparently kept records. He's been cooperating with the territorial investigation." "Why?" Coombs doesn't say. My guess is he was new enough that he didn't understand what he was getting into, and old enough to know what it would mean if he stayed in. She picked up the letter again. There will be a federal inquiry. Crane will almost certainly lose his position. Prentice? A brief pause. Prentice is a more complicated situation. He knew. He was careful about what he put in writing, but he knew. Rowan thought about Crane on the porch, with his city coat and his careful smile and his papers for a dead man's signature. He thought about the 3 families who'd packed and gone to Oregon and Idaho and Kansas because no one had shown up with documentation and a dead notary's name before they'd had a chance to fight. It's not enough, he said, for those families. No, Evelyn said, it's not. She said it without trying to soften it, which he'd come to expect from her and value in a way he hadn't always valued honesty that didn't comfort. What happened to them happened, and the consequences of it are permanent. The inquiry might produce accountability. It won't produce the land back. Then what's it worth? She thought about it genuinely. It means the next family has a better chance, she said. That's what most justice actually is. Not repair, prevention. She folded the letter. It's not satisfying. No, but it's what there is. He sat with that for a while. Then he got up and went out to start the day because the day needed starting regardless. And that was another thing he'd learned, or relearned, over the course of the winter, that the work goes on, that the mountain asks questions every morning without regard for what has been resolved or left unresolved, and answering those questions is its own kind of continuity. He wrote to Svensson that week. Not a long letter, he wasn't a long letter writer, but a direct one. He told the old man what Coombs had said about his claim. He told him to hold. He offered, in the imprecise language of a man who didn't make offers easily, that if Svensson needed someone to ride to Harlow with him when his own case came up, Rowan would make the ride. Evelyn read the letter before he sent it. She handed it back without comment, but she met his eyes for a moment, and he knew she'd seen what he'd meant by it, which was more than the words on the paper. Svensson wrote back in 9 days. 1 paragraph. He would hold. He appreciated the offer. His wife would have liked Evelyn, he thought. Rowan read that last sentence twice and then folded the letter and put it in the box under the bunk where he kept the things that mattered. It was the first week of May when he made the bird. He'd been working on it for 3 weeks, in the evenings, in the half hour after supper when Evelyn wrote in her journal, and the fire was low and the mountain was quiet. He used a piece of ponderosa pine, a knot section he'd saved from the woodpile because the grain was interesting, and a knife he'd had since Oregon, the one with the antler handle that Claire had given him one birthday when they were still in Portland and had no idea yet what the mountains were actually going to ask of them. He worked slowly. He wasn't a carver by habit or training, just by the occasional necessity of the kind of life that produces all its own objects. And the bird was imperfect in the ways that handmade things are imperfect. One wing slightly heavier than the other, the beak a degree too sharp, the tail feathers suggested rather than precise. But it was recognizably a mountain bluebird. You could see what it was meant to be. He finished it on a Tuesday evening and set it on the table and looked at it for a while. Evelyn was in her room. He could hear the small sounds of her moving around. A drawer, a page turning, boots set down. The ordinary sounds that had become, over the course of a winter and now into spring, as familiar to him as his own breathing. He picked up the bird and held it in both hands and thought about what he was going to say. He was not good at this. He knew he was not good at this. He had spent 12 years in the excellent company of silence and had let the skill atrophy, whatever skill he'd ever had. He thought about Claire briefly, and that was not grief anymore exactly, more like the memory of grief, a shape he recognized without being overwhelmed by. Claire would have laughed at him sitting at this table, turning a lopsided wooden bird over in his hands, trying to find words. She would have laughed kindly. She had always laughed kindly. He thought that she would have liked Evelyn. He got up and knocked on the door of the back room, which he had never done before in 6 months of sharing this cabin, because there had never been a reason to before. There was a pause, and then the door opened, and Evelyn stood in the doorway in her everyday dress with her hair down, loose and more gray than dark at this point, he realized, more gray than she'd probably intended to let him see, and she looked at him and then at his hands. She looked at the bird for a long moment. "Mountain bluebird," she said. "Yes, you made it. It's not, the wing is off. The wing is fine. She looked up at him. Her expression was careful in the way it got when she was feeling something she hadn't decided yet how to address. Rowan, I need to say something, he said. And I'm not good at this, so I'm going to say it plainly, and you can... He stopped. You can take it however you need to take it. She waited. She was good at waiting. I've been alone a long time, he said, and I told myself that was a choice, a reasonable one, that I'd tried the other thing and it had... He looked at the bird. That it had ended badly and that being alone was safer and that I wasn't... He found the word with some difficulty. Suited for anything else, for depending on anyone or anyone depending on me. He looked up at her. I was wrong about that, he said. Not about the grief. The grief was real. But I built something out of it that wasn't... It wasn't strength, what I was doing up here alone. It was just fear with a fence around it. She was very still in the doorway. You came here because I put an ad in a paper, he said. And you came because you needed a place, and I needed, whatever I needed. And neither of us came for this. He said the word this without quite specifying what this was, which was cowardly, possibly, but it was all he could manage. But I don't know how to stand here and pretend I don't... He stopped again. Tried again. I don't want you to stay because of the advertisement, or because of the winter, or because of any arrangement. I want you to stay because you want to. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. I'm not the easiest. I know that too. And the leg is probably going to... Rowan. Her voice was quiet. I stayed the first night. I didn't have to. You remember? The coffee was already on before you woke up. That first morning. She looked at him steadily. I decided that first night that I wasn't leaving. Not because of the advertisement, because I looked at this cabin and this mountain and at you, and I thought... She paused. I thought, this is a place worth being, and that's not something I've thought about somewhere in a long time. He held out the bird. She took it from his hands. She looked at it, turned it, ran her thumb along the line of the wing, the heavier one, the imperfect one. It's good work, she said. The tail is... Rowan. The corner of her mouth did the thing he'd been watching it do all winter, the almost smile that was never quite a smile and was somehow more expressive for that. It's a good bird. He exhaled slowly. Stay, he said. It was one word, and it was not romantic, and it was not nothing. I already am, she said, the same way she'd said things all winter, plainly, without decoration, meaning every syllable. He nodded. She nodded. Neither of them did anything dramatic, because neither of them were dramatic people, and the moment didn't ask for it. She stepped back into her room and put the bird on the small shelf beside the north window where the light in the morning would hit it. He went back out to the main room and sat by the fire, and after a while she came out too and sat across from him, and they were quiet together in the way they'd been quiet all winter. Except different. Except with something named now that had been unnamed, which changed the texture of the quiet without changing the quiet itself. The bird sat on the shelf in the back room for 2 days. On the third morning, Rowan came in from the barn to find Evelyn had moved it to the windowsill in the main room, the east-facing windowsill beside the dried flower in the bottle, where the first light hit it every morning when the sun came over the upper slope. He stood in the doorway and looked at it there. He didn't say anything, neither did she, but she watched him see it, and that was enough. May moved into June the way it does in that country. Slowly at first, then all at once, as if the mountain finally remembered it had permission to be warm. The south-facing slopes turned green in earnest. The creek settled from its urgent spring volume to a steadier run. The calves Rowan had worried about all winter were thick and healthy in the lower pasture, and the calf pen that had drawn wolf sign in November seemed to have resolved itself. The pack had moved north, Cord Phelps reported, following the elk. Phelps came up the mountain in mid-June with his son, the 17-year-old that Evelyn had correctly assessed as more trouble than help. The boy looked at the homestead with the appraising eye of someone who hadn't expected it to be as substantial as it was, and Phelps looked at Rowan and then at Evelyn and said nothing for a long moment. Heard the ruling came down from Helena, Phelps said, on the railroad's other claims. Coombs wrote us, Rowan said. Crane's out. Prentice is fighting it, but they're saying the federal inquiry has documentation going back 4 years. 6 claims total, 4 of them fraudulent, 3 of those involving the same dead notary. Phelps shook his head. 26 years I've been in this valley. Never seen anything move that fast through the territorial system. The evidence was clean, Evelyn said. Phelps looked at her. That it was. A pause. Svensson got his confirmation last week. His land secure. He asked me to tell you. Evelyn's expression did something brief and real. Good, she said. He also said, Phelps pulled a folded note from his coat pocket. He wrote it down because he said he'd get it wrong if he tried to say it. He's not much of a talker. Evelyn took the note. She read it. Rowan watched her face. Something moved through it that he'd seen before. The same thing he'd seen when she'd exhaled outside the courthouse, the release of a thing held tense for a long time. She folded the note. She didn't tell Rowan what it said, and he didn't ask. And later he'd find it tucked into the back of her journal, and he'd never read it, because some things belonged to the person they were meant for. Through June and into the long days of early summer, they rebuilt what needed rebuilding and repaired what needed repairing and made the decisions that a homestead requires every season, which are mostly practical decisions dressed up in the ordinary language of survival. Which fence section was worth reinforcing before the fall? Whether the south wall of the barn needed new siding or just caulking? How many pounds of flour to put up before winter? They argued about the flour. Evelyn thought more. Rowan thought her estimate was high. They compromised on a number that turned out to be almost exactly right. One evening in late June, sitting on the porch in the long mountain twilight that comes at this elevation when summer is doing its best work, the sky going from blue to amber to a color that doesn't have a straightforward name, Rowan said, I want to fix the east gable. Evelyn looked at the east side of the cabin. The gable had been in his peripheral vision for years, a section of the original construction he'd done quickly and alone and had always known was slightly wrong. The angle off by a degree or two, the fascia board warped. What's wrong with it? She asked. The angle's off. Has been since I built it. Bothered me every spring when the snowmelt runs wrong and I have to clear the ice buildup. You built this cabin yourself? Yes. Alone? Yes. She was quiet for a moment. I'll hold the board, she said. If you need someone on the ladder. He looked at her. You're not going on the ladder. I didn't say I'd go on the ladder. I said I'd hold the board. A pause. You'll need 2 hands free to set the angle correctly. Someone has to hold. He looked at the gable. He looked at her. Fine, he said. They did it on a Saturday, early in the morning, before the day's heat built up. He went up the ladder, and she stood below and held the fascia board steady while he worked. And she did it without commentary or instruction, just held it at the angle he'd indicated with his hand when he'd positioned it, firm and patient, until he had it where he wanted it and drove the first nail. Good, he said. Hold on, the left end is lifting slightly, she said. He looked. She was right. He adjusted. Now, she said. He drove the nail. He drove 3 more. He stepped down the ladder, and they both stood back and looked at the gable. It was right. You could see it was right. The line clean, the angle true, the thing that had been slightly wrong for 14 years corrected by 2 pairs of hands on a summer Saturday morning. Better, Evelyn said. Yes, he said. They stood looking at it together in the early morning light. The mountain was quiet around them in the way it is quiet in summer, full of sound, actually, birds and wind, and the creek's constant commentary. But underneath all of it, there was the foundational quiet that Rowan had carried alone for so long, and it was different now with someone else standing in it beside him. He thought about the advertisement. No illusions offered. He'd written that because he'd meant it, because he'd believed that what he had to give was limited and specific, and that naming the limitation was a form of honesty. And it had been honest. But what he hadn't known when he wrote it, what he'd been incapable of knowing, sealed up in his 14 years, and his grief, and his fence building, was that illusions and hope are not the same thing. He'd had no illusions. He still didn't. This life was hard. The mountain was difficult. The winters were severe. His leg would never be fully right, and Evelyn was stubborn and occasionally infuriating and had opinions about flour quantities that were frankly excessive. None of that had changed, and none of it would. But hope was something else. Hope was what you had when you stopped being afraid of needing someone. And Rowan Mercer, who had been afraid of exactly that for 12 years, Standing on this porch on a June morning with the gable fixed and the mountain doing its work around them, was not afraid of it anymore. He was not sure when it had happened. It didn't announce itself. It was just, at some point the fear had been replaced by something else. The way winter is replaced by spring, not in a single day, but in the accumulation of days until you look around and realize the cold has been gone for a while. "Rowan?" Evelyn said. "Yeah." She was looking at the east window, the one that faced the sunrise, the one he'd built facing east without thinking about why. "You never told me who decided on that window, the direction." He looked at it. The morning light was coming through it the way it came through every morning, hitting the windowsill where the bird and the bottle stood. "Claire," he said. He said it the way he'd been able to say it since January, without flinching, without the 12-year wince, just her name and what it meant and the fact that it was part of the history of this place. She wanted to watch the sun come up. Evelyn nodded. She looked at the window for another moment. "It's a good window," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." They were quiet for a while. Then she went in to start breakfast because the morning required it, and he went to check the water level in the barn. Barn barrel because that required it too. And the day did what days do. It went on and asked its questions, and they answered them together. The summer settled into the mountain like something that had decided to stay a while. Rowan's limp eased slightly in the heat. The cold was worse for it, the doctor had been right about that, and he moved through the long days of the homestead with an energy he hadn't had in years, which he attributed to the leg healing and suspected was something else entirely. They had neighbors now, in the loose way that mountain people have neighbors. Phelps came up twice a month and sometimes brought his wife, a practical woman named Ruth, who took to Evelyn immediately in the way that practical women tend to take to each other. Svensson rode up once, in July, on a horse that was almost as old as he was, and sat on the porch and drank coffee and didn't say much and seemed, Rowan thought, to be doing the thing that people do when they want to see that something they'd fought for is real, confirming its existence with their own eyes. Coombs rode again in August, from Helena. The federal inquiry had produced indictments for 3 Continental Mountain Railway officials, Crane among them. Prentice had negotiated a reduced charge in exchange for testimony. The young lawyer who'd admitted the irregularities in the Harlow courtroom had been granted immunity and had, according to Coombs' careful language, been cooperative to a degree that had proven highly useful to the investigation. The 3 families who'd taken relocation payments were pursuing a civil claim with the assistance of the territorial court. Coombs thought they had a reasonable chance. Evelyn read the letter twice and then set it on the table beside the supply inventory in her careful handwriting, and she sat with both hands in her lap and was quiet for a moment. "It's not everything," she said. "No," Rowan agreed, "but it's something." "Yes." She nodded once, to herself, and then stood up and went to see about dinner, and that was how Evelyn Hart processed things, stated them plainly, gave them their due weight, and then moved on to the next required task, because grief and satisfaction both had their limits, and the work didn't stop for either. Rowan watched her move around the cabin and thought, this is what it looks like to be beside someone. Not in front of them, not behind them. Beside. He'd forgotten that distinction. Or maybe he'd never quite learned it. He'd been 29 and in love and certain of his own solidity when Claire died, and in the grief that followed, he'd collapsed the complexity of partnership into the simple equation of loss, and from loss into isolation, and from isolation into the conviction that isolation was a choice he'd made rather than a wound he'd refused to let heal. What Evelyn had done, without setting out to do it, without a plan for it, just by showing up and being exactly who she was hold the wound open long enough for it to close properly. The way you have to do with bad injuries. The way it hurts more before it stops hurting. In September, when the first early cold came down off the peaks and the light took on the particular amber quality of a Montana fall, Rowan rebuilt the steps on the south side of the porch, 3 steps that had been softening for 2 years and were genuinely dangerous by now. He used good pine, properly dried, and he took his time with the joints, and when he was done he put a small carving on the newel post at the bottom, not deliberate, just a habit of hands, a simple mountain shape in the grain of the wood. Evelyn saw it when she came in from the barn that evening. She stopped and looked at it and put her hand on it briefly, the way she'd put her thumb along the wing of the bluebird. She didn't say anything. She came up the steps and past him and went inside, and the screen door closed, and after a moment he heard the sounds of dinner being made and the sound of the fire, and the sound of the mountain doing its long work outside, and everything that needed to be said between them had been said, and everything that needed to be done between them had been done. And what remained was this: the porch and the steps and the carving in the wood, the bird on the windowsill, the coffee in the morning, the east window facing the light. It wasn't a perfect life. The legs still ached in the cold. The eastern fence line needed replacing before next winter, and that was going to be 2 weeks of hard labor. Evelyn had a stubbornness about certain things that he suspected was permanent. He had a stubbornness about other things that he knew was permanent. They would disagree about the flower again next spring. They would argue about the roof and about whether a particular section of the property line needed to be re-registered in light of the railroad case, and about how much cordwood was enough cordwood, and none of those arguments would have clean resolutions. But the mountain was theirs. The cabin was a home. And the man who had spent 12 years convincing himself that standing alone was the same as standing strong had finally, at 41, with a hitch in his step and a wooden bird on a windowsill, understood the difference. He went inside. The fire was going. Dinner was almost ready. Evelyn was at the stove with her back to him, and the lamp was lit, and outside the first stars of the fall evening were coming up over the eastern ridge, and the mountain held them both in its cold, indifferent, magnificent hands. "Close the door," she said, without turning around. "You're letting the cold in." He closed the door. He was home.